Hola, I'm Hannah from Speak Better Spanish. I'm here to help you stop overthinking Spanish and actually speak it. Okay, today everyone is going to finally hear from the person who is constantly confusing me with Mexican Spanish in real life. So, introducing Arturo. He's from Northern Mexico. He's also one of our Spanish coaches here at Speak Better Spanish. And he says things all the time that technically translate into English, but emotionally make no sense to native English speakers. So, today we're going to break down how Mexicans actually communicate in the day to day. Welcome back.
Wow.
Well, welcome back to everyone, and thank you for joining us. We're here with Arturo. He is one of our Spanish language fluency coaches here at Speak Better Spanish. He is a native speaker from Mexico, Northern Mexico, and actually has an extensive background in teaching, probably 20 plus years of teaching, wouldn't you say?
Posiblemente.
What'd you say?
Sí, que posiblemente más o menos esos años.
Long time, long time.
Ujú.
So we're breaking down some of the cultural and language things behind interactions in Spanish. And one thing we're going to be talking about today is what is it? Okay, the topic is how bilingual couples create their own communication style. So, well, actually, let's have you tell the story. So when we met, I'll set the scene. When we met, I only spoke to Arturo in Spanish. Tell us a little bit more, Arturo, about how tell the audience a little bit more about how we normally communicate, who speaks what language and why, and in what situations that might change. And yeah, tell the audience a little bit about how all of that developed as we started dating.
Sí, cuando recién nos conocimos, como que no definíamos muy bien en qué idioma hablar. Entonces, a veces hablábamos español, a veces hablábamos inglés. Si estábamos con un grupo que hablaba español, pues hablábamos español. Si estábamos con un grupo que hablaba inglés, hablábamos inglés. Pero conforme fue pasando el tiempo, quienes hablen más de un idioma, sabrán que tal vez se oiga raro esto que voy a decir, pero que tenemos distintas personalidades dependiendo el idioma en el que hablemos. Y creo que es muy sencillo porque pues la personalidad se basa en tu fluidez, en el vocabulario que tienes, porque de ahí vas tomando para pues tal vez tu sentido del humor, tal vez para etcétera, ¿no? Entonces, como que nos empezamos a dar cuenta, sin pensarlo, que tal vez mi personalidad en inglés era diferente a mi personalidad en español y con Hannah lo mismo, su personalidad en inglés era distinta a su personalidad en español. Entonces, muy natural se fue dando que ella hablaba inglés y yo hablaba español, porque pues bueno, yo entendía perfectamente lo que ella me decía y ella entiende perfectamente lo que yo le digo en otro idioma. Y nos dimos cuenta que la real Hannah es la real Hannah hablando inglés y el real Arturo es el real Arturo hablando español. Y pues bueno, así lo hemos hecho y así lo hemos decidido. Vuelvo a lo mismo, porque pues yo entiendo perfectamente todo lo que ella me habla en inglés, porque pues yo hablo inglés y ella entiende todo lo que yo digo en español, porque ella habla español, pero seguimos teniendo cada uno pues como nuestra personalidad. No significa que haya ocasiones en las que terminemos hablando idioma o terminemos hablando el otro, o dependiendo, como lo dije hace unos momentos, dependiendo el grupo con el que estemos, pues nos adaptamos y hablamos de un idioma u otro idioma. Más o menos por ahí.
Oh, interesting. And I guess we're fortunate in that we both have a strong understanding and command of the other's language. It would be different if, for example, if I barely spoke Spanish and you barely spoke English, and you mostly spoke Spanish and I mostly spoke English, well, things would be totally different because we wouldn't be understanding each other on the same level. But fortunately, it just so happened to work out that we both have a pretty advanced understanding of the other language and the culture. Of course, that doesn't mean that we understand 100% of what the other person says. There's always going to be expressions and humor and cultural references and just certain things that no matter how much you've lived or experienced or know of a language or have lived in a certain country that speaks that language, you're just never going to know everything. Like I'm not going to know the childhood songs that Arturo grew up with, even though I've been living in Mexico for years. And he might not necessarily know, some pop culture references that I grew up with when on the TV when I was a kid or things like that. So we're very fortunate that it so happened to work out this way. But Arturo, how did you decide or how did you figure out that the real me, that's the most authentic version of myself, is the English speaker? And how did you figure out that for yourself that that real you is the Spanish speaker?
Yo me di cuenta desde hace mucho, incluso antes de tener una relación contigo. Para quienes no sepan, en este canal, yo hace muchos años estaba por ahí en la universidad. Viví un año en Estados Unidos en un programa tal cual de au pair, o sea, de ir a cuidar niños mientras estudiabas. Y allá, pues bueno, mi comunidad de amigos eran de esta misma empresa, que eran amigos y amigas de otros países, ¿no? De tanto latinos como Argentina, Colombia, pero también de otros destinos como Alemania, como Suiza, Francia, etcétera. Entonces el idioma común era el inglés. Y yo notaba que mi personalidad era distinta, yo no era el real yo, obviamente me comunicaba y etcétera, pero yo desde hace muchos años me di cuenta que como que uno tiene, no doble personalidad, sino tal vez herramientas distintas. Si eres, tu humor es distinto, tu tipo de bromas es distinta, etcétera, ¿no? Que no significa que sea mejor o peor, pero respondiendo a tu pregunta, sí, yo me di cuenta de eso hace mucho tiempo. También por cuestiones familiares, gran parte de la familia de mi mamá no viven en México, viven en distintos lugares de Estados Unidos. Entonces el idioma inglés pues ha estado muy en mi vida desde hace muchos años. Y pues bueno, desde ahí yo identifiqué que pues hay un Arturo en inglés y hay un Arturo en español, ¿no?
Interesting. And I would say the same is true for me. And I feel like part of it is culture and language are so closely intertwined. It's really hard to separate one from the other. So, for example, I speak Spanish, obviously, and have lived in Mexico. And the way I express myself in Spanish is based on the culture of Mexico, what we've been talking about with relationships, the warmth, the social aspect, the humor, the exaggerations like that are around me in the day to day, that isn't the same in my English personality. And my English personality, even I don't know, maybe my tone of voice changes. I don't know, just the references and like even the way we express ourselves, not only humor, but whether we're more talkative or more quiet, whether we're making like puns or what types of jokes and references we make. So yeah, there's just so much to it that I feel like probably if anyone else speaks more than one language, we'd love to hear from you if you also find this to be true, that maybe there's certain slightly different versions of yourself depending on what language you're speaking. Of course, your core is still the same, what's important to you, who you are, the experiences you've lived, and so on. But depending on like how people express themselves in the language and how advanced your command of that language and culture is, will affect. And I think one of the last things to develop when we learn a language is humor, because there's just so much nuance to it. It's just, there's so much possible depth and ways it can go. Even, I mean, as you guys can see from these videos, like there's so much exaggeration and teasing as part of the Spanish speaking and specifically the Mexican culture. Like even just as a side note before we finish, what do you call the fan that's in my living room?
El helicóptero.
Arturo, what do you call the fan that's aha, the helicoptero? Aha. Obviously, you're not saying that there's a helicopter in my living room. It's an exaggeration to say it's a big and powerful and maybe even noisy fan that moves a lot of air. Mm-hmm. So
Correcto.
there's just lots of little nuances to things, and the deeper you dig into learning a language, the more you can express yourself in that way, and you have those different sides of your personality. You can connect with other people who speak that language that you encounter in that way as well. So it's very cool. Any final thoughts on this topic, Arturo? I know we hit a bunch of different things. But any other thoughts or comments you want to leave the audience thinking about?
No, digo, nada más que ahorita dijiste, y estoy de acuerdo con eso, que incluso nuestro tono, nuestro timbre de voz es distinto cuando lo hablas en otro idioma. Mi timbre de voz en inglés es distinto. El tuyo en español es distinto. Hablo del tono, ¿no? De la posición de la voz.
Ajá,
Entonces, sí. Ujú.
ajá. That's true. And speaking of that, that reminds me, I have a friend from Egypt. When I hear him speaking Arabic, his voice is very deep and it's very like, it's a loud and deep and kind of like a commanding type of voice. But when he speaks in English, he sounds like a teddy bear. He sounds just soft and gentle and caring. And I think it's a reflection of like the language, the culture. There's many factors, but it's interesting to see not only in Spanish, this plays out in other languages as well. Yeah, very interesting. Awesome. Well, thank you, Arturo. We've shared a lot of insights and a lot of our own lived experiences with the audience. So if anyone has questions or comments, you can drop them below and we'll see you guys in the next video.
See you. Bye.
Bye.